Hello, I'm Dan Polster, and I'm pleased to be here talking with you remotely. I'm going to discuss freedom and responsibility, Pesach and Shavuot. I'm going to start by discussing the biblical connection of these two holidays, Pesach and Shavuot, then the rabbinic connection of the two holidays, two festivals, and then discuss the two themes of freedom and responsibility, the Jewish connection, the American connection, and how they're particularly important today. We're celebrating now the biblical holiday of Shavuot. In the Bible, it's the Feast of Weeks. We count 7 weeks from the barley harvest to the wheat harvest, and the 7 weeks is counting the Omer. We start on the second night of Pesach. The biblical references in Leviticus chapter 23, Deuteronomy chapter 16. Of course, Shavuot is one of the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 festivals where people made pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem to make the sacrifices. We had Pesach, Shavuot, and then Sukkot in the fall. In biblical times, there were 3 pillars of our society, our religion, our society, our culture: the land of Israel, the temple in Jerusalem, and the priesthood. Remember, back then, ordinary people felt that they couldn't communicate directly with God. They needed the priests as intermediaries, and the vehicle were the sacrifices, and they're spelled out in meticulous detail in the Torah, and the priest had to do them just right so that the petitioner would feel that his or her prayers would be answered by God. The Romans conquered us in 70 CE. We lost our land, conquered, dispersed. The temple was destroyed. We no longer had need of priests because there was no temple in which to conduct the sacrifices. By all rights, that should have been the end of us. After all, what happened to the great and powerful ancient civilizations of that time? The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. Any of those around today? Of course not. So, obviously, we did not become extinct. What happened? What happened was that the rabbis recreated, repositioned Judaism around the one essential thing that we still had, the 10 Commandments and the Torah. They were portable. They could be learned and studied anywhere. The teachings could be transmitted from generation to generation. But we had no holiday commemorating the receipt of the 10 Commandments and the Torah. Shavuot fit the bill. Celebrating the wheat and the barley harvest didn't really resonate anymore. We had lost the land. Most of us weren't farmers. Shavuot fell at the precise time, chronologically, when we received the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. So it fit the bill. So the Feast of Weeks became Zman Matan Toratenu, the time when we received the Torah and that we celebrate receiving the Torah. The counting of the Omer, which traditionally linked the barley harvest to the wheat harvest, now linked Pesach with Shavuot. Pesach, the Exodus, is the defining moment in our history. The liberation from slavery, the transformation to freedom. Throughout history, people generally achieve freedom. How? By fighting a revolution, throwing off a foreign power, a colonial power, or some repressive regime. It's this military victory that we're going to celebrate this year on July 4th. Whether we're going to have our fireworks or not, we're still going to celebrate July 4th. That's what Israelis just celebrated on Yom Ha'atzmaut, the military victory in the War of Independence in 1948. Pesach, of course, is far different. We were freed not by our own hands, but by the miraculous power of God in a way that we and everyone else, then and now, could only see in that way, by divine miracle. You can't go more than 2 or 3 pages in the Siddur, any Siddur, whether it's the daily Siddur, the Shabbat Siddur, the Machzor, without some reference to the Exodus. There's some reference to the Exodus in most of the Parshiot we read on Shabbat. It's in the Kiddush. Typically, the reference is instructive or illustrative. We're commanded to do something, to act in a certain way, to refrain from doing something, because we were slaves in Egypt, and God freed us. There's some references to that in Mishpatim, Parshat Mishpatim, Exodus chapter 22 and 23. You shall not wrong the stranger, neither shall you oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And a stranger you shall not oppress, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is why we're to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. It's very interesting that in Leviticus chapter 23, right after the description of the Feast of Weeks, we're told, you shall not reap the corner of your fields, nor shall you gather the gleanings. And of course, that's because back then, if one didn't have land, one didn't eat. And there was no kosher food markets or food pantries or anything. So this was a way that people who were poor could survive. You didn't harvest the corners of your fields, and again, that was a sign of respect, so people could just walk around the edges and just take what they needed, and if you were harvesting, you left the gleanings off the wagon so people could pick those up. The whole purpose of our receiving our freedom was that so we would live responsibly and be or legoyim, a light unto the nations. Without the 10 Commandments and the Torah to guide us, however, the freedom would have meant nothing, and we would not have made it through the 40 years in the desert, let alone until today. In fact, the reason we needed to wander for 40 years is because it became apparent that people who had a slave mentality would never have the capacity to live independently and to make the difficult moral decisions that would be necessary. And this is why God determined that we needed to wander in the desert for 40 years, to make sure that everyone who had grown up a slave in Egypt died, and that their children and grandchildren who didn't have the slave mentality and who would therefore have the capacity, the ability to make independent decisions, tough moral decisions, those people would inherit the land of Israel and build a free society. So that's why Pesach and Shavuot are inextricably linked, and the Omer reminds us of that. Freedom without responsibility is just licentiousness, and if people are not free, they cannot be held accountable for their actions. Maimonides wrote that we count the Omer between the anniversary of our departure from Egypt and the anniversary of the giving of the 10 Commandments, because that was the aim and object of the Exodus. The deliverance from bondage was not an end in and of itself. It was the prelude to Sinai. Liberty without law is a dubious gift, whether to men or to nations. And interestingly, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 12, when God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, God said, "Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the token unto you that I have sent you. When you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain," because the burning bush is right by Mount Sinai. So again, the point of the liberation, the Exodus, was to serve God upon the mountain, to receive the 10 Commandments and the Torah. So these two themes, freedom and responsibility and how they're intertwined, play out in American society and throughout our history. With American citizenship, of course, we always remember and celebrate our rights and freedoms that are protected by the Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to pray or not to pray as we see fit. And of course, it's critically important when you're a minority. But at the same time, we have responsibilities toward each other. They go hand in hand. Freedom without responsibility doesn't cut it. And I remind every time I perform naturalization ceremonies in the courthouse, I remind our new citizens of their freedoms and their responsibilities and how they go hand in hand, and how it's very important for citizens to have the responsibilities as well, to exercise their right to vote and to vote responsibly and to stay informed and to have respect and tolerance for everyone else. All right, how does this tie in today, right now, when we, for the last 2.5 months, have been wrestling with this COVID-19 pandemic? Our leaders are wrestling with finding the correct balance between freedom and responsibility. I keep thinking of Cain's anguished question and challenge to God after he kills Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? Interestingly, in the text of Bereshit, God does not answer Cain directly. There's an anguished question. There's no direct answer. But one could say that the whole remainder of the Torah is a resounding yes. Today, people are clamoring, they're protesting, that their personal liberty is being restricted, that they can't congregate in groups, they can't go to tattoo parlors, they can't travel, they have to wear masks. But guess what? Restrictions are necessary if most of us are to survive this pandemic. I can't just live for myself. My freedom runs up against yours, and if I'm free to do whatever I want, I'll be placing you or your loved ones in great danger, particularly if you or someone you live with happen to have a serious medical complication that puts you at high risk of developing the more serious strain of COVID that ends you up in the hospital or on a respirator. So our leaders today are trying to figure this out, and it's not easy. And you go forward, you try things, you may loosen things up, open things up, and then realize either people aren't following the restrictions voluntarily, or they're abusing them, or the virus is coming back, and we've got to pull back. But again, it's freedom and responsibility. One without the other is inadequate. So we're celebrating Shavuot this year while maintaining social distancing. Through the wonderful support of Harriet Mann and the hard work of everyone else at B'nai Yeshurun and Rami here, we've been able to preserve this wonderful tradition of the Tikkun by adapting it to the present situation. We're exercising our freedom responsibly, and I'm very happy to have participated. Chag Sameach to all of you.